Hey everyone, hello. I'm back and I'm going to be reading a couple more chapters of The Ghostly Tales of Connecticut by Ellie O'Ryan. So we left off on chapter 3. Chapter 3, The Headless Horseman of Canton. The town of Canton is quaint and charming. It never deserved to be the site of such a gruesome crime. Some tourists visit Canton to kayak on the Farmington River. Others come to browse in the antique shops, and some are drawn to hike the nature trails or the abandoned railway. All of them must beware the Headless Horseman of Canton. He rides on the darkest nights, driving his ghostly steed at a furious pace. The horse's eyes glow bright red, flickering as though they were made of flames. Its hooves pound the road, but make no noise, making it all the easier for the headless horseman to sneak up on those who are unsuspecting. A cloak of mist, which seems to appear and disappear at will, also helps the headless horseman take his victims by surprise. Many drivers have had to swerve unexpectedly to avoid a collision when the headless horseman suddenly appears before them in all his haunting glory. But who was this unfortunate soul who departed from this earth in such a violent and grisly manner? His name has been lost to history, but his terrible ending reverberates through Canton still, like a haunting echo that no one can escape. In the year of 1781, as the Revolutionary War neared its end, a young French lieutenant had an important task. As an ally of the revolutionaries, the brave lieutenant usually had no reason to fear travel through Connecticut. But this night was different. The lieutenant was also a paymaster. It was his responsibility to pay the soldiers, so he carried heavy leather saddlebags filled with money for the men at Saratoga. As night fell and his horse grew tired, the lieutenant had no choice but to stop at Dudley Case's tavern. A hot meal, a night's sleep, and he'd be on the road at first light, riding fast to make his important deliveries. At least that's what should have happened. His boots echoed as he walked across the tavern's wooden floor. All the regular patrons turned to look at the stranger in his fine uniform. The faint clink coming from his saddlebags was unmistakable. "Evening, friend," Dudley Case might have said. "What brings you to these parts?" The French lieutenant smiled apologetically and said a few words with a heavy accent. It was clear to all that he didn't speak much English. He was a stranger to them, a stranger in every way. Case was solicitous. He served the French lieutenant a hot meal, then escorted him to a private room for the night. Before he shut the door, the lieutenant in his fragmented English requested that Case wake him at dawn. Case was only too happy to oblige. The lieutenant, however, was never seen again. At least, not alive. According to Case, the lieutenant had left the tavern at first light, not even lingering for a cup of coffee or a bite to eat. The regular customers accepted Case's report at face value. They could only imagine what it might be like to carry such vast sums of money, even if only for a night. The sound of clinking coins from the bags would long live in their memory. Several weeks later, though, a search party of French and American soldiers arrived at Case's tavern. The officers had many questions about the missing lieutenant, for he had never reached Saratoga. Indeed, since his arrival at Case's tavern, he had never been seen again. The officers painstakingly interviewed everyone at and around Case's tavern, but despite their diligence, no trace of the French lieutenant was found. As for his part, Dudley Case spent the rest of his days living in prosperity. Folks in town often wondered how the Case family had acquired such riches, especially when everyone else had fallen on hard times. Townspeople wondered about that, just as they wondered about the ghostly apparition, cloaked in mist, that had begun to appear along the road on the moonless nights. The gaping hole where the ghost's head should be is what truly horrifies any soul so unlucky to cross paths with the headless horseman. It wasn't until 1874, almost 100 years later, that a grisly discovery revealed one possible clue about what happened to the French lieutenant. The tavern had a devastating fire and was destroyed. Half buried in the tavern's lonely basement was a skeleton, discovered only when a crew of volunteers arrived to clean up the smoldering remains of the building. Strangely, a human skull was found in another section of the cellar, leading the crew to believe that someone had met a most unfortunate end here in Case's Tavern. Could those bones belong to the long-lost lieutenant? The human remains found in the tavern were given a proper burial, but was that enough to set his soul at rest? If they truly did belong to the French lieutenant, is he finally at peace? It seems not. The Headless Horseman will not rest until he completes his urgent mission. The Headless Horseman will not rest. Chapter 4. The Witches of Nineveh Falls. Nineveh Falls in Killingsworth, Connecticut, are as breathtakingly beautiful as they are deadly. It is no wonder that such a hauntingly lovely place had been the site of so many horrors. The rocky sides of the ravine, the slippery rocks, the fast-flowing waters, and the jagged stones can spell danger for the living. Indeed, for too many people, they have spelled doom. For some, the dark history of Nineveh Falls has been part of the appeal. There is a long legacy of witchcraft in the area. In the gloomy woods near the Connecticut River, witches were said to meet in secret, brewing vile concoctions in their cauldrons and chanting evil spells in the shadows. Two of them, according to legend, were Goody Wee and Betty Wee. When Goody Wee held her infant daughter, Betty, in her arms, did she already plan to teach her baby to chant spells and place curses along with learning her alphabet and her numbers? When other mothers taught their daughters to cook, did Goody Wee teach Betty to brew potions? When other little girls gathered wildflowers, did Betty harvest poisonous herbs and deadly toadstools? We will never know exactly how Goody Wee tempted her daughter to join her in the dark arts. But the evil pair is still spoken about in voices of hushed horror, for their nightly cavorts to torment goodly people are remembered still. According to legend, the wee witches skulked through the lands, entering any home at will, even if all the doors and windows were locked. For sport, they would spoil the finest cream so that butter could not be churned from it. Of course, the wee witches were not the cause of all the troubles that lurked around Nineveh Falls. Unseen spirits plagued the paths and roads leading to tragic ends. Near the end of the 19th century, a local woman was out for a picturesque drive in her horse-drawn carriage when the unthinkable happened. Some supernatural force, unseen but potent, frightened her horse so terribly that he began to buck and pull at the reins. No mortal could control an animal so possessed by terror, and onlookers could do nothing but watch in horror. As the horse galloped out of control, straight toward the bridge, the woman's panicked screams ricocheted off the rocks as the horse's eyeballs widened and rolled about in their sockets. She pulled on the reins so hard that the leather straps cut into her palms, but it was no use. There was no stopping the horse, who ran straight at the wooden railing, no pause, no hesitation. The rail splintered into shards of wood that rained down into the waters below, as the horse, the carriage, and the woman careened over the edge. None survived. If that tragic accident wasn't caused by the wee witches, it was only because they kept busy with their own mischief along the roadway. Every merchant and farmer knew that the wee witches traversed the roads in gleeful search of their next victim. Every merchant and farmer knew that what fate awaited them if they crossed paths with Goody and Betty Wee. They had a choice, really, a simple choice. Unveil the contents of their cart and let the wee witches take their pick of all their wares. Or if they refused, they would continue their journey with dread, knowing that the cart, when they least expected it, would overturn in a spectacular fashion, spilling all its contents. The entire load would be lost, and if the wee witches were in a particularly foul temper, the farmer's life would be lost as well. It wasn't much of a choice at all, really. Perhaps most chilling of all was how much the wee witches delighted in their evil doings. Not even the roaring Nineveh Falls could drown out their gleeful cackles. Why should the wee witches work an honest day when their malicious mischief was so much more fun? Chapter 5. The Cursed Treasure of Charles Island. Charles Island has long been a sight with an air of otherworldly menace about it, but what Captain William Kidd did there in 1699 is among the worst acts of evil the island has ever seen. Is it any wonder that his curse has lingered there for more than 300 years? Captain Kidd was a notorious pirate who terrorized the seas, looting and pillaging and striking fear into the hearts of even the bravest sailors. His criminal crew was just as fearsome, but they too harbored dread in their hearts of what Captain Kidd could do. His crimes were so terrible and his reputation so notorious that authorities came up with a plan to capture Kidd once and for all in a desperate attempt to restore order to the high seas. They started an elaborate rumor that if only Kidd would journey to Boston, he would receive a full pardon for all his crimes. The trap was set, and Captain Kidd found the bait irresistible. Just because a pardon awaited him, or so he thought, Kidd had no intention of putting an end to his crimes. His ship was loaded down with ill-gotten cargo as he sailed up the Atlantic coast. He had 2 items on his agenda: to boast about his upcoming pardon and to bury his loot so that he could safely retrieve it later. Charles Island was a deserted piece of land just half a mile off the coast of Milford, Connecticut. Of course, Captain Kidd wouldn't have cared if he needed to slaughter a few residents to accomplish his goal. But the seclusion of the island was part of its appeal. The wooden chest was secured with iron fastenings, which would have made it heavy to carry even when it was empty. The chest, though, was far from empty. It was filled to the brim with shiny gold coins and glittering jewels in a rainbow of colors. Just a small handful of the loot would be enough for one of the Captain Kidd's men to live in luxury for the rest of his days. But none of the pirates were foolish enough to dream of doing such a thing. After all, no one knew better than them what Captain Kidd could do, and he was especially vicious with thieves and traitors. Captain Kidd marched across the sandy shore of Charles Island while his men followed, struggling to transport the weighty chest. No one knew precisely what Captain Kidd was looking for as he scanned the empty island. But when he found it, he knew. Here, he might have said as he pointed to a secluded wooden spot, not visible from the shore unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Then he stood back and watched as his crew began to dig. One shovelful at a time, earth flew through the air as the hole grew deeper and deeper. Only Captain Kidd knew how deep he wanted it. For their part, the men didn't mind the labor of digging the hole, even when their shovels scraped against flinty stones or gnarled roots. They were grateful for anything that might delay what would happen next. But it was impossible to delay the inevitable. All too soon, it seemed, Captain Kidd was satisfied with the depth of the pit his men had dug. It was deep enough to hold the treasure chest, and deep enough to hold something else too. Perhaps Captain Kidd said something like, "That's a fine depth," or perhaps he just nodded his head. His crew was silent as they stood around the hole, their shovels still, their heads bowed. Now, for the moment, they had secretly dreaded. It was time for drawing lots. One of them held out his fist, which clutched a handful of sticks. There was one for each member of the crew. From the look of it, each stick was the same length, but the men already knew that was an illusion. If they were afraid, they didn't show it. With bluster and bravado, each man reached for a stick. Each man reached for his fate. The sticks were the same length, all except for one. The man who chose the short stick knew what that meant. Maybe he tried to smile. Maybe he tried to act brave. Maybe he said something like, "Let's get it over with then." I'm sorry, my dog's playing in the background. Sorry about that. Captain Kidd's sword was sharp and swift. It was a flash of silver as it sliced through the air, as it sliced through the man's throat. He fell to his knees almost before the blood bubbled out of the gash in his neck. Dead in an instant, his body tumbled into the hole, sprawled across the treasure chest. His blood soaked into the wood of the chest. It pooled in the bottom of the pit. His skin was still warm when the first shovelfuls of earth rained down on him. Buried with the treasure, Captain Kidd was certain his slain sailor spirit would guard it as ferociously as he would were he still alive. By the time the dirty job was done, it was low tide, and the sandbar connecting Charles Island to the town of Milford had been revealed. Captain Kidd didn't spare another thought for the murdered mate as he marched across the sandbar with the rest of the men and paraded through the town. The pardon he had been promised was so close he could practically taste it. But Captain Kidd himself was in for a nasty surprise. When he arrived in Boston, he was swiftly arrested, tried, and convicted of piracy. 2 years later, he met his own fate at the end of the hangman's noose. Captain Kidd died without ever revealing where his treasure was buried. Now Kidd's restless spirit also guarded his long-buried loot. Whispered rumors persisted about the treasure that lingered under the soil of Charles Island. Even after 100 years, the thought of discovering a bounty of stolen pirate loot was appealing enough that two men were willing to risk everything in their pursuit of Captain Kidd's long-lost treasure. In 1838, they stole onto Charles Island, moving swiftly and stealthily so that no one would see them. They started to dig, and dig, and dig. Eventually, their relentless quest for pirate treasure paid off in the sound of a loud, dull thwack, the noise of spades striking solid wood. The men stared at each other in shock and disbelief. They dug faster, more furiously, eventually tossing their shovels to the side and scraping handfuls of dirt off the aged chest. Forgetting all about stealth and secrecy, the men pitched the dirt over their shoulders. They were so fixated on the idea that they'd soon be richer than their wildest dreams that they didn't even notice the old, yellowed bones. At last, the chest was cleared of dirt and debris. Sparks flew as they began to stab the padlock with their spades. All they had to do was break the rusty lock and the riches would belong to them. Or so they thought. Suddenly, an ear-shattering shriek pierced the sky. The men dropped their spades and covered their ears from the deafening sound, which was like nothing they had ever heard of before. And they looked at the heavens only to behold a terrifying sight. A headless demon made entirely of moldering bones was flying at them at dizzying speed. The men scrambled out of the hole just before the demon descended into it, exploding into a burst of blue flames and choking smoke. They didn't wait for the smoke to clear. The two men ran as fast as they could to escape the island and Captain Kidd's curse, their hearts thundering in their chests. In the light of a new day, though, the demon seemed less terrifying, at least compared to the thought of forever abandoning the riches that the men had left behind. So they mustered all their courage and set off for Charles Island once more. When they arrived, there was no sign of the demon and no sign of the treasure. The deep hole they dug had been filled in as if by supernatural forces. There was no sign that the dirt had ever been disturbed. They dug again, always keeping a watchful eye on the skies, always keeping an ear listening for that same telltale thwack of a spade on wood. After hours toiling in the sun, the men had dug a pit twice their height, far deeper than the one they had dug just the day before. It was no use to continue. They left Charles Island with far more questions than they'd had when they first arrived. Who had moved the treasure? Who had filled in the hole? Perhaps Captain Kidd knows the answer, but dead men tell no tales. Okay, that's it for today. I will read some more later on. My voice is getting a little hoarse, so hopefully you enjoyed those 2 tales. And hopefully I didn't scare you too much. Until the next video, everybody, take care and have a good time, good day or night. Bye.